This Blessed Union by T-Drop. Narrated by Michael Hagiantonis. Chapter 3. Leo stared up at the modest airship hovering just beyond the boarding room's windows. She swayed, very subtly, against the reinforced cables and pulleys that bound her to the earth. Her main body was solid and streamlined in darkly stained wood, with gleaming copper and steel winding decoratively about the hull. The sail, the crowning jewel of any airship, was a graceful, bullet-shaped structure of blue canvas. It stretched out at nearly twice the size of the ship tethered below, kept inflated by steady streams of scalding air. Enormous propulsion engines mounted to the ship's back quarters, aided by the smaller one hiding within the sail. Leo had watched the blue canvas slowly rise from the roof of the port bunker, gradually puffing out to full capacity until the ship was airborne. The sight was too satisfying for him to tire of it, even after seeing it countless times before. He'd accompanied Shay on enough trading excursions growing up that he'd become very comfortable with air sailing. While witnessing the negotiations with potential suppliers had been fascinating and educational, he'd eventually preferred to travel only to familiar destinations or the odd supply trip to Shay's established business partners. Even then, he'd slowly become wary of people as a whole, until he stopped traveling altogether. Meeting new people had always been intimidating for Leo. Being a Faeblood inevitably meant drawing attention to himself if he spent any amount of time with someone. His traits were moderately easy to conceal, but could become starkly noticeable in an instant, generally during conversation. It had been much easier to ignore unsettled reactions when he was young and naive, before he'd known he was a royal outcast solely due to those traits. King Theor had done Leo no favors by shattering his blissful ignorance. Having to suddenly face who and what he really was had nearly broken him. Worst of all was the knowledge that Theor had only done so as a precaution for the future, a gambled investment that might pay off. It had occasionally made Leo sick with worry over the years, not knowing if, when, or where he'd be displaced for his father's whims. Coming of age had lent him some measure of calm and security, but now he was questioning whether it made any difference. King Theor was still dragging Leo out of his comforting solitude, forcing him to face an abundance of strangers and unfamiliar surroundings. That airship, with the blue sail, was merely the first step on a winding road of unknowns. Leo gripped his violin case tighter, having let the king's servants take his single suitcase. His only other travelling bag was a wide leather satchel, the weight of its strap heavy across his chest. It was tightly packed with the only other possession Leo considered valuable enough to keep close during this voyage.
"A beauty, is she not?"
Theor asked, stepping up beside him to admire the airship as well. Leo shrugged as if unimpressed. "Shay's trading ships are bigger." King Theor made a short, amused sound at the boastful rebuff.
The Blue Arrow is built for speed over cargo capacity. You will still find her very comfortable, despite her compact size."
Leo kept his eyes fixed on the few sailors they could see roaming about the ship's deck in brisk preparation for their departure.
"I do hope you have at least one warm coat packed. You will need it if you intend to go above deck during the flight."
Leo gave a small, irritated sigh. It seemed that his stony silence wasn't enough to stifle the king's persistence. "I know plenty about air travel. If you insist on speaking to me," Leo said dryly, "please make it something of substance. Speaking only for the sake of speaking vexes me to no end." King Theor looked down at him with one of those infuriatingly disappointed expressions.
"You might want to adjust your attitude. Small talk is the nature of formal and royal gatherings, for business or pleasure. There will be occasion for both on this trip.
I am versed in small talk, Leo insisted, but it is not a skill I find pleasure in practicing unnecessarily.
I assume,
King Theor said with a hint of sarcasm,
that is yet another skill that Shay has taught you.
You have met him, said Leo proudly. If anyone can embody the meaning of diplomatic social butterfly, Shay can. He could crack a smile from a gargoyle while purchasing its pedestal, if he wished. The king chuckled passively.
True, indeed. I would have preferred to trade blows with him over this entire matter, rather than with Isaac.
Irritation fueled Leo's resolve, and he finally turned to look Theor square in the face. I hope you mean that figuratively, Your Highness. Shay is all cordiality and laughs, unless he needs to stand up for his loved ones. I have seen him break a man's nose with only his finger and thumb, as punishment for wronging me. Leo was satisfied to see the king's eyebrows lift in unmasked surprise.
Seems quite the overreaction. What had the man done to warrant such an act?
He broke my heart. Intrigue and discomfort played over the king's face by slow turns as he processed that information.
"Ready to embark! All aboard!"
came a rough voice over the voice stone on the ceiling. King Theor straightened up, expression becoming neutral again.
Well, let us be off then.
Leo followed Theor and his entourage of servants through a doorway on the far side of the boarding room's walls. It opened onto a temporary bridge latched between it and the deck of the ship. The transition from the quiet, hollow-sounding room to the sudden rush of warm, salty wind and the noise of a thriving crew briefly invigorated Leo. There was always a lively energy in the air before a departure that was so infectious Leo couldn't fight its rapture. The early morning sun was dappling the ship's dark wood and metal with splashes of gold through puffy white clouds. The engines thrummed deeply, a steady mechanical heartbeat reaching to every corner of the ship. The harbour's ever-present gulls wailed while soaring about the ship, curious and ready to trail along for the first few miles of the course. There were 2 people waiting for them at the end of the bridge. One was a finely dressed man, the other a boy who looked slightly younger than Leo, his blonde hair nearly white in the morning sun. He adjusted round-rimmed spectacles as Leo and the king grew nearer, and bowed along with his older counterpart. They both spoke a traditional greeting, but not quite at the same time. The older man gave a tired expression at the garbled result. King Theor acknowledged them each with a nod.
"This is Dion, my personal airship captain," he told Leo, before looking at the blonde boy and saying, "I shall let you introduce yourself."
The boy then bowed to Leo deliberately, making his stomach flutter with discomfort. Not even their household servants bowed more than their heads to him. When he spoke, Leo recognized his Sparian accent at once, even through the fluid Aldonian. "Prince Leonardo, my name is William McBray. I was sent by King Reinhairs to be your personal escort and manservant on behalf of the Kingdom of Spar. Think of me as something of an ambassador, if a very inexperienced one." He then stood up straight and gave a sincere smile that reached to his bright blue eyes. "I shall perform at my best, but please excuse any formal stumbling. I have very little ambassador training." Leo shook his head, appreciating the honesty. "No mind. I have very little prince training myself."
"William will show you to your quarters, Leonardo," King Theor said dismissively. "Your luggage should already be waiting there for you."
Leo nodded and began following William without another word to his father. The boy led him across the deck to a doorway set into a length of wall at the back of the ship. From there, they descended a tight spiral staircase, metal creaking beneath their feet as they wound their way down past several floors of living quarters. William stepped off the stairs and into a narrow hallway, lined with doors. Each had a copper or tin etching of the Aldonian national crest above the room numbers. William opened room 15, and stood behind it politely. "Please make yourself at home, Prince Leonardo." Leo went inside and studied the cabin. It was a decent floor plan, given the smaller size of the airship, a padded bunk, with room for storage beneath and above. The standard port window covered by a small curtain, and a longer curtain on the other side of the room, discreetly concealing the latrine. A mirror and sink stood against the same wall. Beyond that, it was bare bones, all built from the same dark wood and mixed metals. "If you require anything at all during our voyage, please summon me," William said, in that neutrally pleased cadence all good servants used. "The black voice stone in the panel there is the channel to my own. Simply activate it and I will answer you directly. Would you like the precise set of rune words?" "Thank you," Leo said, placing his violin case and satchel on the bed. "But I'm not used to having on-call servants." William hastily pulled out a small booklet and ink quill, scribbling on a blank page. "I will write it out for you all the same, Prince Leonardo." Just Leo is sufficient." An uneasy smile appeared on William's face, and he tapped the end of his quill against the booklet nervously. "I couldn't possibly address Uldonia's prince without an honorific, Your Highness." "Please do not call me that, either. It makes me very uncomfortable." William looked perplexed for a moment, as he stood, silently thinking while they stared at each other. Eventually, he asked, timidly, "Would you allow me to call you Prince Leo? Or, at the very least, my lord?" The slight desperation in William's voice drew a clear picture for Leo. The boy had to be under tremendous pressure to represent his kingdom properly and favourably, but Leo had immediately shot down one of the easiest aspects of being a dutiful servant. "If that would make you feel better, then please do," Leo said, resignedly. "Just keep in mind that I'm not accustomed to it at all." "Forgive me, Prince Leo," William ventured, still looking unsure. "But has no one ever called you by your title before?" "Perhaps a few times in my life," Leo muttered, pulling out a chair from the small table in the middle of the room and sitting down heavily. "I guess I should adjust to it, considering where I'm going, and the amount of discussion I'll be expected to partake in." William tore out the page with the rune words on it and placed it on the table. "You must be terribly tense about this entire affair, my lord." "That is quite the understatement," Leo said flatly. "I'm just grateful my parents taught me enough about politics and haggling that I might not appear a complete idiot during these negotiations, or whatever they're labelling them." "I'm not sure what they're officially called either," William admitted, his voice and speech becoming more casual to match Leo's. "Negotiations is probably the best description." Leo was about to dismiss the boy, not wanting to dwell on that topic, when a realization dawned on him. He sat up straighter, frowning. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, my lord." "Isaac and I weren't aware that my father was coming to visit until a few days ago. So how is it that you, a Sparian representative, are already here on the Uldonian king's airship?" William looked confused. "I'm not sure what you mean, my lord. I was told nearly 2 weeks ago that I'd be escorting you back to Spar." Leo's lips parted in surprise. 2 weeks? You had much greater notice than we did." That does seem greatly unfair. If there's anything I can do or say to put your mind more at ease at any time, please let me know." It was difficult, but Leo forced an empty smile. "Thank you, William. I really do appreciate that. But I'd honestly just prefer to be alone right now." The boy nodded in understanding and made to leave, only to hesitate in the doorway. "I hope I'm not stepping out of line, my lord, but I was told I'd be escorting both you and Sir Isaac. Was I misinformed?" Leo's blood ran a bit colder. "He chose to stay behind." "Oh," William stammered. I didn't know. I apologize. Don't, Leo said quietly. You know now, and it's for the best, anyway. William seemed to recover his composure and bowed suddenly. As requested, I'll leave you to yourself, Prince Leo. He paused, before the door was entirely closed, to say, If it would make you more comfortable, my lord, you can call me Will. That small gesture managed to pull a small smile from Leo. Thank you, Will. It does. Then the door was closed on the boy's beaming face. Leo relaxed and blew out a deep sigh. He faintly heard the calls of the captain and sailors preparing the final steps before embarking. Leo felt no desire to go back on deck and watch. He'd seen plenty of takeoffs before. He went over to his door and locked it, then dropped down onto his mattress. It was as deep and comfortable as the bunks on Shay's trade ships, but with 2 additional pillows. As the distant bellowing of the airship's engines increased, Leo felt the ship climb higher into the air to reach ideal flying altitude. The wood frame creaked and groaned like a colossal shifting animal when it cleared the port's shelter and became prey to the wind. There was an almost sickly sensation of the ship dipping downward several inches before stabilizing. The energy of dozens of spells became almost physical against Leo's senses as they activated, infusing the ship with a variety of protections and efficiencies. With one more surge of mild disorientation, it began to glide smoothly forward. No turning back now. Leo decided to detach from that knowledge the best way he knew how. He opened his satchel and pulled out a wide leather bracelet. It was riveted with copper latches that held tiny rods of glass. He briefly studied the etching on each before unfastening one and taking out a long tin case. Inside its padded lining were several dozen more glass rods, stacked 2 deep. They faintly clinked together as he put away one rod and selected another. He fastened it into the free latch on the bracelet, then put the case and the satchel away at the foot of the bunk. Leo quietly spoke an entire sentence of rune words, and the little glass rod on the bracelet began to pulse with a green light. Instantly, that light sprang up into a slender glowing line that wound up through the air to split and settle in both of his ears. The spell ensured that only he could hear the glass. He could have purchased the newer models of glass that set directly into the ears, but he preferred the spectacle of using a spell to transfer the sound. Leo took a deep breath and leaned back against the pillows as a sweet voice began crooning in his ears, along with gentle music. If anything could ever block out his troubles, it was the enchanting vocals of Rorik Kavir, captured in glass. The man was said to have magic in his very voice for how extensively he could use it. No note was too high nor too low for Rorik's blessed range. Time blurred as Leo let the strand of light float from one glass to the next and back, cycling through all 10 songs that the bracelet held. He could have kept the strand playing one glass repeatedly, but he didn't care to at the moment. He just wanted to focus on the music, the instruments, that incredible voice, and ignore where he was going, and what had happened this morning. But, inevitably, the scene of his departure from the villa kept flashing in his mind, in the quiet space between songs.
Are you steadfast in your decision to stay behind?
King Theo had asked, when they'd met Isaac at the front doors.
Quite,
Isaac had responded, stiffly, shaking the king's hand.
I doubt I would be useful, on either front. Then I shall see you when next the occasion allows.
The 2 men had exchanged short bows before the king left through the door. When Leo walked up to Isaac, his heart had sunk at the cold detachment in his uncle's face. He had honestly thought that Isaac's stubbornness would have been redirected, morphed into a determination to accompany Leo and change his mind. But as he held out his hand for Leo to shake, the truth had hit him like a cold draught.
Safe voyage, was all that Isaac had said when Leo set his jaw, mirroring his uncle's expression, and clamped his hand almost furiously. I will see you soon. Certain of that, are you? Leo had asked in a quietly taunting voice, hoping to provoke some reaction, any reaction. All he had received was a hardening around those empty, dark eyes. I have no doubt. Those words had only made Leo's pride bristle, and he'd broken the handshake, brushing past Isaac to join King Theor in the waiting carriage. Each step he took away from the villa, without hearing Isaac call him back, strengthened Leo's resolve. Once he reached the carriage door, he'd heard the front doors of the villa closing behind him. He looked back in time to watch them snap shut, with a subtle finality. He was, indeed, making this journey alone. Leo found his fists balling up so tightly that his nails bit into his palms, the memory spiking his heart rate despite the soothing song in his ears. He pulled himself up off the bed, fixing the bracelet to his wrist so he could keep listening while he moved around the little cabin. A lingering peek from the porthole revealed very little at this angle, only open blue sky and distant fields of clouds. As much as he wanted to hide from anyone and everyone, Leo's need to stretch his legs was becoming too strong to keep him below deck. He tugged out his suitcase from beneath the bunk and retrieved a coat from the very top of the contents. It was soft leather lined with wool, perfect for being on deck. As Leo unlocked the cabin door, he made sure to again note the number above his cabin and where it was in relation to the stairs at the end of the hallway. It was surprisingly easy to get lost wandering an unfamiliar airship, no matter the size. He donned the coat as he climbed the staircase and stopped to buckle it closed before opening the door to the surface. A gust of chilly air struck his face when he stepped out onto the wind-swept deck of the Blue Arrow. The sun was so powerful up here that the glowing trail of Leo's glass spell looked dim in its light. He'd been hoping that they might be sailing in a patch of cloud, but it was now clear skies for miles. Leo pulled the tinted goggles from the hood of his coat and strapped them in place over his eyes. His face relaxed at the relief from the sunlight and the wind. Goggles were not always required on deck, but between bright sun, damp clouds, and residual wind, despite the streamlining spells, it was best to keep them on hand. There were several sailors, all wearing similar goggles and heavier gear, strolling about and keeping watch on the multiple layers of cable holding the ship to the sail. Even the sizable shadow it cast over the smaller deck couldn't diffuse the sun's harshness at this midday hour. Leo tilted his head all the way back to watch the firm and filled-out canvas rippling slightly overhead. It nearly matched the blue sky all around them. Leo used a rune word to increase the volume of his glass, muffling the symphony of wind, engines, cables, and voices. He walked to the very edge of the deck and leaned on the tall railing, looking down through thick safety netting to the miles of empty air beneath. This region was all lush forests and fields. Crystal blue veins of rivers occasionally cut through the green patchwork of land and poured out into sparkling lakes. The ship was so high up that at a certain point, the observable horizon seemed to stretch out forever into a foggy void. The ocean was already far behind them, as they'd been sailing directly inland since they left the coast, so there was no point searching for it. Leo instead looked northward, where they were heading. Walk north, and you'll find Spa, as the saying went. Leo had been to Spa once in his life, but he'd been very young. They'd only made port for a single night, while Shay picked up supplies. It was twilight when he'd seen the capital city of Thrak from a great distance, a giant mountainside spilling out an entire civilization of twinkling lights onto vast stretches of dark plains. They'd been back in the air and long gone before he awoke the next day. What Leo remembered the most from that trip was not Spa itself, but the treacherous pass through the peaks of the bordering mountain range. The Shudder was one of only 5 mountain passes wide enough to allow an airship access to Spa, and also held the highest devastation rate. It had frightened Leo to no end, being on deck while the ship sharply weaved and navigated through the narrow spaces between jagged mountainous walls. He'd been able to sense the compounded strain and effort of all the people working as one to keep the ship intact: the captain, the navigator, the mage, the technician, the sailors, and so forth. He desperately hoped that they all knew their jobs well enough to bring them out alive on the other side. Shay had also teasingly filled his head with fears of air pirates anchored to the lower ridges, just waiting to ambush passing trade ships. It had made for an entirely terrifying half of an hour that he'd never forgotten. The Blue Arrow was much smaller than that long, outdated trade ship, but Leo still swallowed in apprehension at the thought of going through the same passage again. It would be more than a day before they reached the Shudder in the Spear-Tip Mountains. Another day and a half after that, and they would arrive in Thrak, at the heart of Spa. Leo rubbed his chilled hands together, sighing. He doubted they had gone 20 miles yet, and he was already, begrudgingly, aware of Isaac's absence. Despite his age, Leo could not shake the feeling that he was in some way rebelling, calling his adopted father's bluff so brashly. Now, here he was, on his way to the most northern of northern cities, without a single ally by his side. If Leo had just kept his mouth shut, he and Isaac might be standing here together right now, gabbing on about how insufferable all this was. But he'd kept quiet far too long to keep the peace between himself and Isaac, he reasoned. It would have happened sooner or later, Leo thought angrily. I made the right choice. I'd rather have it out at home, rather than making a scene in the middle of Castle Thrak. His frown eventually dropped, and his eyes strayed behind them, southeast, toward the ocean. It finally dawned on him the sheer distance he would be from home by the time they reached their destination. That truth slowly fell over him, weighing him down in a heavy cloak of miserable uncertainty. Every chug of the engines, every mile sailed, every gust of wind carried him farther from home. I made the right choice, he said aloud, as though trying to convince himself. But his words were quiet and hollow, offering no ease to the painful doubts clouding his heart.